Welcome, dear friends, to the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center Sunday morning program. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be made available on the Nova Baha'i Center website. At this time, we invite you all to turn on your cameras to create a friendly and welcoming atmosphere and to also support friendly conversation with our dear speaker when that time comes. To enable your cameras, you'll need to move your mouse to the lower part of your screen and click on the video camera icon. You have been muted at this time to reduce audio feedback. And unmuting will be enabled after the presentation for you to ask questions and participate in the discussion. I want to take a moment to thank the Sunday morning program team. We will now begin with our devotional program.
ای حضرت دستم بگیر إلهي تراني منقطعا إليك ومتمسكا بك إلهي تراني منقطعا إليك ومتمسكا بك فاهدني في الأمور ما ينفعني لعز أمرك فاهدني في الأمور ما ينفعني لعز أمرك وعلوي مقامي أحبائك
Good morning, dear friends, and welcome to this Sunday morning program. Thank you for those beautiful devotions. We are always so happy to be with you all and look forward to seeing you each week. As you may know, this month, the Nova Baha'i Center Sunday morning program has featured programs bringing a special focus on Abdu'l-Bahá, the appointed successor of Baha'u'llah and the perfect exemplar of his teachings. He passed away 100 years ago, and Baha'is around the world have been commemorating this anniversary. In this vein, today's program will provide some context into the work, some answered questions, by introducing us to the compiler of this work. Ms. Moda Khademi is an independent researcher who has presented papers and talks at Baha'i and non-Baha'i national and international conferences in Europe and in the United States. Since the year 2000, she has been researching about the life of Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney and has presented papers about her findings at Baha'i, Iranian, and Middle Eastern Studies conferences, as well as the Embassy of Latvia in Washington, D.C., and the Library of Congress. She has published several papers based on her years of research and the biography that she has written. Her book is called Some Questions Answered: The Life of Laura Barney, and is to be published in January of 2022. So today's presentation will be a combination of a webinar of the Wilmette Institute presented by Ms. Khademi, followed by the opportunity to ask her questions and advanced discussion on what you will hear today. Please allow me to welcome Ms. Mona Khademi. Welcome, dear Mona. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. I am grateful to Ismail for this invitation and to those who have helped with today's program, in particular to Farinaz and to Parisa. And thanks to all of you for joining today and all those who will listen later. I am honored and grateful that on this 28th day of November, 2021, a day after the Baha'is from around the world have observed the 100-year anniversary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, I am speaking about an early Western believer who was devoted to him. Abdu'l-Bahá, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, who died in 1892, he designated his son to become the interpreter of his teaching and leader of the faith. Abdu'l-Bahá led a life of service and dedication to his father's teachings of loving kindness and unity. His life is an inspiration to the millions of people worldwide who are all honoring him now, 100 years after his passing. By the way, I would like to dedicate today's presentation to my mother, who passed away on this day 16 years ago. Now we will hear the presentation, and I will be here to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you. I will talk about Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney, an American woman who at a very young age of 21 heard about Abdu'l-Bahá, a spiritual leader from the East, and visited him in Palestine, accepted the faith that he was promoting, the Baha'i faith, and followed its teachings for the rest of her life. Many of you may know of her greatest achievement, that of compiling some answered questions, which is based on the questions that she posed to Abdu'l-Bahá and his responses. Laura Barney visited him at least 8 times, each time staying from a few days up to several months. She also had the honor of being in his presence in the West. It is interesting to note that she had received at least 26 tablets and letters from Abdu'l-Bahá. Today, I will share with you what attracted her to this faith and its teachings. Why had she traveled to the desolate city of Akka so many times? What were the attributes of Abdu'l-Bahá that she noticed? How did her devotion to Abdu'l-Bahá impact her life? What were some of her accomplishments? I have tried to use the original tablets of Abdu'l-Bahá to her and her own words about him, and have not tried to paraphrase them. Also, in order to save time, I am not going to mention when I'm reading a quote. Laura Clifford Barney was born in 1879 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her family was from Dayton, Ohio, who moved to Cincinnati and later in 1889 to Washington, D.C. Both her mother, Alice Pike Barney, and her father, Albert Clifford Barney, were rich. She was brought up in luxury, had a pampered childhood, and was sent to a boarding school outside of Paris at a young age. Her family were Episcopalians. Laura was studying dramatic arts in Paris in 1900 when she attended a gathering at the home of May Bowles, later Maxwell. That may be the first time she heard about the new faith and became seriously interested. She learned about the teachings of Baha'u'llah and that of his son Abdu'l-Bahá, who was in Akka, Palestine. Laura had been looking for something to wrap her soul around. She sent a letter to Abdu'l-Bahá stating that she wanted to meet him before accepting the teachings of the faith. As soon as she received a reply, she made her first pilgrimage to Haifa in October of 1900. Laura gave a talk 1 year after her first visit and made the following remarks about the details of her visit with the master. Abdu'l-Bahá was known to the Baha'is as the master, Agha. She wrote, I arrived at Haifa and sent this message to the master, that I believe that he must be the Christ spirit of the day, that the whole world was waiting for him, but that I could not feel it, but that if he was the Christ spirit of the day, he, of course, could prove it to me by making me yearn to follow the only path of true self-sacrifice and virtue. I sent this message because I always believe that everything should be based on sincerity, and I do not want to go in an attitude which I did not absolutely feel was mine. We arrived at the humble house of Abbas Effendi, Abdu'l-Bahá, and were sitting with a number of the believers when the master came in. Before he had really entered the room, I was so surprised and overwhelmed by a wonderful atmosphere that I had never felt before. An atmosphere of perfect, complete humility and majesty at that time. The master swept into the room and, bidding us to be seated, began to speak. Of course, I could not understand the tongue in which he spoke, very unfortunately, but the spirit was so strong that went forth that one could follow the words that came to us through the clear translation of Ali Gholi Khan. My eyes that had until then been blinded gradually opened, First, we remained perfectly still. After a while, I felt the tears coming to my eyes and running down my cheeks. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of absolute gratitude, tears that one might shed if one had been locked up in a dark prison for years. It seemed that I had often tried to get out of this darkness that surrounded me, but in vain. So as I heard the Master's words and felt that he was the Christ spirit of the day, my tears continued to flow and my heart to beat with absolute love, absolute hope and happiness. Some years later, she wrote, I think the impression one has of Abdu'l-Bahá is in that it grows gradually and suddenly at the same time. I know when I first had the honor of going to Haifa, at once I was impressed by his sanctity, by his wisdom, his majesty, his humility, by the manifestation of all the great qualities in such a simple, natural way. Then came Laura's second trip to Akka, which took place almost 6 months after her first trip in spring of 1901. Laura's second visit lasted between 10 to 12 days. A newspaper article in the United States reported about her visit to the Holy Land and wrote, Miss Barney's contribution is interesting as showing the attitude of a woman follower of the head of this faith. She is a firm believer in Abbas Effendi, Abdu'l-Bahá, whom she calls a perfect being. In 1902, Laura traveled to Washington, D.C. to visit her mother. Laura may have received the following tablet from Abdu'l-Bahá at that time, excerpt of which is, I beseech God that every instant thou mayest glimpse a fresh light of divine bounty and attract enduring confirmations. O thou beloved maid servant of Baha, I will henceforth address thee as Amatul-Bahá, handmaiden of Baha, to signify that thou hast attained a special rank and that this title will be a crown of beneficence upon thy head, whose gems and pearls will shine forevermore, reflect upon future centuries and ages, and thou wilt know how precious a gift this is. Laura's third visit to Akka was in early 1904 at the Master's invitation. She stayed until spring of 1906 with a few short side trips to Egypt. Abdu'l-Bahá was confined to the city of Akka and was permitted to receive only a few visitors. It was during those years that she wrote that Abdu'l-Bahá decided that she should remain in Akka to familiarize herself with the Persian language. From Akka, she wrote to her mother, at present, I do not think I need to leave Akka this fall. The Master wishes me to remain to pursue my studies, his teachings and Persian. In another letter to her mother, she stated, the Master's life is a marvel to me. Never have I seen such a useful and perfect being. She learned more and more about the faith while in the Holy Land and started posing her questions to Abdu'l-Bahá. He revealed answers to her questions, and she wrote down the answers. Her questions were related to significant matters such as theology, materialism, the reality of spirit, and interpretation of several Bible verses, and many other concepts. Then, late spring of 1906, came Laura's travels to Turkmenistan and Persia, the native land of Baha'u'llah that she was asked by Abdu'l-Bahá to visit. Laura decided to have a male companion, and she decided to travel with Hippolyte Dreyfus. Hippolyte was born in 1873 in Paris. He was the first French man to believe in Baha'u'llah. He had visited Abdu'l-Bahá in 1903. Laura had met him while attending one of May Bolzel's gatherings in Paris. She traveled with Hippolyte and a chaperone, Madame Lachenay. Laura was the first Western Baha'i woman to travel to Persia, today's Iran. I will not be discussing the details of this trip. I will just mention that they first visited the first Mashraq al-Asghar, house of worship in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, before traveling to Iran. This stay lasted for over 2 months. While in Iran, they visited Tehran, Rasht, Qazvin, Isfahan, Kashan, Zanjan, Tabriz, and Maku, and met with many dignitaries and Persian Baha'is. Next picture, please. Then Laura returned to Haifa to report Abdu'l-Bahá right after this trip. She commented, "We couldn't express to Abdu'l-Bahá our deep gratitude at what we had seen and heard. Little by little, we spoke of it." Abdu'l-Bahá wrote a tablet to Sadr al-Sutur after hearing her stories and experiences of her travels. Sadr al-Sutur was a Baha'i scholar whose classes Laura had attended while in Tehran. Abdu'l-Bahá wrote, "Amatul-Bahá, Laura Barney, arrived with supreme glad tidings and eloquent speech, with teary eyes and a heart full of the spirit of joy. Each day and night, praising the friends in Iran and her devotion to that loving friend, Sadr al-Sudur. In truth, she is enthralled with those who have remained steadfast in the covenant and enamored with the pure and noble friends." Soon after Laura's return to Paris from her travels to Middle East, she started working on some answered questions. She had received Abdu'l-Bahá's permission to publish it. The master had corrected the Persian draft and then had approved and signed each corrected segment and stamped it with his seal, the same seal that was used for his revealed tablets. I'm not going to discuss the details of how she posed her questions, how notes were taken down, and how they were reviewed. They are covered completely in her biography. However, I wish to share this tablet of Abdu'l-Bahá to her. I consider you in such high regard that I want you to be happy always and to advance and progress each day so that you may attain to the knowledge of the divine. Thus far, no one has received this favor whereby such lessons were dictated and transcribed. You are the only one who has attained to such a bounty. This bounty will be eternal. Therefore, be thankful to God and remain in utter happiness and joy. The book that she compiled, Some Answered Questions, collected and translated from the Persian of Abdu'l-Bahá by Laura Clifford Barney, was published in 1908. In addition, the Persian edition was titled An-Nur-ul-Abha fi Mufawazat Abdu'l-Bahá, and the French translation, Les Leçons de Saint-Jean d'Acre, which was carried out mostly by Hippolyte, were both published that same year. Laura gave a talk in the United States in 1909, and she covered many aspects of her life in Akka and her observations of Abdu'l-Bahā's characteristics and attributes. She said, "It is not what I think is of much importance, but what I saw and such incidents as came to my notice and of the characteristics and habits of Abdu'l-Bahá." She continued, "All around the surrounding country of Akka, he is known as Abbas Effendi. They look upon him as a very wise man, likening him to Solomon. They come to him for advice, and many difficult questions are put before him for solution. He is felt to be a wise and remarkable saint. He is extraordinary in his dealings with the poor, being their best friend." She continued, "Above all, I have seen the master day in, day out, unfaltering and joyous in his mission of education and love. As the center of the covenant, his station is humility. He would be a brilliant being in any walk of life and would have made a success in any walk of life because he depends wholly upon that force which is of God." Laura found his teaching style to be simple yet mystical. His straightforward way of expressing a concept would coalesce with the listener's inner being. She wrote, "It is difficult to condense into words the volume of force that radiated from his teachings. He spoke simply, and his sentences became a part of one's inner thoughts, seeking a worthy outlet in action." 7 decades later, she shared about her early experiences of meeting Abdu'l-Bahá. She said, "There was only one thing that she wished to say, and this was, the whole life of Abdu'l-Bahá radiated encouragement and spirituality to all those with whom he came in contact, be they high personages or be they the simple poor people he might meet in the street." It is important to learn how Laura reflected on her conversion. 9 years after learning about the Baha'i faith, Laura wrote a letter to a Baha'i friend about it. She summarized what she had experienced in France, England, America, Egypt, Russia, and Persia, and how she had seen the Baha'i faith broaden the minds and uplift the hearts of men. Then she continued, in Akka, I have witnessed that guidance and information radiate from that center to the world at large. I have never seen a simple man, through the assistance of God, closely in touch with the innermost lives of millions of fellow beings. In here, I have seen the guidance of servitude and love. Laura continued her correspondence with Abdu'l-Bahá and received many tablets from him. Laura and Clifford Dreyfus were married in 1911. They adopted the last name of Dreyfus-Barney after their marriage. She had known him for 11 years. It was through their collaborations on the translations of some answered questions and their travels together that they realized how well they were matched. Laura may have asked Abdu'l-Bahá about marriage and questioned if marriage would interfere with her activities and service, because Abdu'l-Bahá sent her a tablet and mentioning the importance of service to the cause of God, as well as the importance of marriage. He stated, this teaching and service doth not preclude marriage. Thou canst take unto thyself a husband, at the same time serve the cause of God. The one doth not preclude the other. The newlyweds received another tablet from Abdu'l-Bahá after he received the news of their union. Your joyous and delightful letter just arrived. In the divine kingdom, you both are considered as the denizen of nearness and in the sight of Abdu'l-Bahá, much esteemed. Thus, what could be better for you two than to be married and in doing so become as one and establish a generation of Baha'is in Paris and bring joy and happiness to all. A few months after her marriage, Laura was awaiting the arrival of the master in Europe. She had a major role in Abdu'l-Bahá's journey to the West. She had invited Abdu'l-Bahá to visit Europe several times. He had traveled to Egypt in 1910. In an undated letter to Laura, perhaps that same year, he stated, I had not given the idea of a journey to Europe much thought, as it was more likely for me to first travel to Egypt. However, in order to meet you, Shomaha, meaning Laura and Hippolyte, I decided to travel to Europe. I am hoping to reach Paris shortly. Abdu'l-Bahá embarked on his journey to Europe in August 1911. When he arrived in Thonon-les-Bains, France, that August, Laura was already there to welcome him. Laura and her husband were his constant companions. They stayed at the Grand Hotel du Parc, the same hotel in which Abdu'l-Bahá was staying. Together with Julia Thompson, who had joined them in Thonon, they were either in Abdu'l-Bahá's room or he was in their rooms, in the most charming informality. They accompanied the master on an automobile ride and drove to a country inn. When Abdu'l-Bahá had his next stop for 29 days in Great Britain, Laura and her husband went to assist him with translations. Lady Blomfield wrote, "Foremost amongst our visitors were Monsieur and Madame Dreyfus-Barney, the brilliant French scholar and his no less brilliant American wife, who spoke Persian with Abdu'l-Bahá, translated for him, and were altogether helpful, courteous, and charming." After London, Abdu'l-Bahá returned to France and went to Paris in October 1911. Next slide, please. He may have stayed with Laura and her husband for a few days before moving to an apartment at 4 Avenue du Camon that they found and rented for him. Abdu'l-Bahá spent a good deal of time at the home of Dreyfus-Barney's, which was not far from his apartment. Laura and Hippolyte again served as interpreters for him and for several other people. Laura translated Abdu'l-Bahā's addresses from Persian into English. The Dreyfus-Barneys held the last meeting in Paris for Abdu'l-Bahá at their home before he returned to Egypt that December. During his stay in Paris, Abdu'l-Bahá attended and spoke at many gatherings. His words and exhortations were written down by several people. It was through the efforts of Laura and a few others that his addresses in 1911 were published in English under the title Talks of Abdu'l-Bahá Given in Paris, later known as Paris Talks. Then came Abdu'l-Bahā's journey to United States, to North America, that started in April of 1912. Laura wrote that she had the honor of gaining his presence during this visit, as did her husband. During the month of May in Washington, D.C. She was with Abdu'l-Bahá when he addressed a group of women and then visited Neighborhood House, a home for the poor that had been established through the efforts of Laura's mother. While Abdu'l-Bahá and his entourage were traveling across the country, United States, Hippolyte received a letter from him that stated, "I hope both you and the maidservant of Bahá, Laura Barney, will be able to render important services on this journey and will welcome the cause of proclaiming the word of God. Convey my respectful greetings to the maidservant of Bahá. I pray God for confirmations and assistance for her." When Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to England after his 8-month tour of North America in December of 1912, Laura joined him in London. Laura wrote that when the master visited Europe, I again gained admittance to his presence. Abdu'l-Bahā's next stop was back in Paris, and Laura and her husband again hosted him. They were in constant touch with their special guest. They accompanied Abdu'l-Bahá to meetings and organized significant gatherings for him in their home. They also invited Persian dignitaries to meet with him. They drove him to historical places in and around Paris, such as Versailles, and arranged for a visit to the Louvre Museum. The Dreyfus-Barneys drove the master to the train station in their car and bid farewell to this special guest, June of 1913. The next time they were able to be with Abdu'l-Bahá was after World War I in 1919, when they went to the Holy Land. They were the first pilgrims to arrive from the West after the war. In a letter, Abdu'l-Bahá stated that it is highly opportune on our part, we await your arrival. Shoghi Effendi, whom Laura knew since his childhood, personally welcomed them at the train station in Haifa and took them straight away to the house of Abdu'l-Bahá, where they would be staying. The master arrived a few minutes later. Shoghi Effendi wrote about them. Oh, how glad and grateful they were to meet him, to speak to him, to hear his voice, to sit beside him, and to feel the touch of his hand. All the friends gathered that evening at the request of Abdu'l-Bahá to welcome them. The next afternoon, Laura and Hippolyte had a few of the friends went to the middle room of the shrine of the Bab, and Abdu'l-Bahá joined them. He gave a talk, and later they all entered the interior of the tomb, and according to Shoghi Effendi, most ardent and inspiring prayers of praise and thanksgiving was offered on the whole, as Mrs. Dreyfus intimated it was a very lovely and spiritual meeting. Soon after Laura and Hippolyte left the Holy Land, Shoghi Effendi sent a letter to Laura. He wrote, "Dear Laura Khanum, now we miss you these days. Tenderly remember the happy days you spent amidst us in the presence of the beloved." That June, Laura received a tablet from Abdu'l-Bahá expressing appreciation for her services. He wrote, "Your services are gratifying and acclaimed, and your hardships and ordeals are noted and recognized. I beseech divine bounties that, like unto a lighted candle, you may light up every assembly, present eloquent speeches and stirring utterances, and with the power of kingdom, cause joy and excitement in the heart of the audience." In 1920, Laura and Hippolyte finally started on the journey to the Far East that they had been forced to cut short at the onset of World War I. They had started on that journey around the world in accordance with the wishes of Abdu'l-Bahá in 1914. He had encouraged them to travel to China, Korea, Japan, India, and other Asian countries, and possibly return to Iran, but could not complete that journey since World War I had started. Now, in the fall of 1920, on their way, they visited Abdu'l-Bahá for a week again. Laura spent much time with him on this visit to discuss social issues. Laura told her sister that their visit with Abdu'l-Bahá had been delightful. The itinerary of their second journey to the Far East included traveling to Indochina, Singapore, Burma, southern China, and India. They embarked on this journey and visited the cultural and historical sites in different countries and met with dignitaries. It was in Rangoon that Laura heard the news of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. This news was devastating and shocking for Laura, who had spent months close to the Master in Palestine, Europe, and the United States. She expressed her feelings in these words: "The Master has departed, finished the bodily link, finished the possibility of going into his presence, of hearing his living voice, foreseeing his thoughtful eyes, finished the expression of love, energy, and patience that was personified in his form. To be with him now, we must turn to our own hearts. We must turn to our memory. We must turn to his written words, and we must fit ourselves to commute with his spirit. The impulse to follow him was irresistible, to leave behind the triteness of earth. But he has told us not to keep for ourselves alone what he has entrusted to us for humanity. Laura reflected on the Master's passing. How vast is our inheritance, not hearsay and legends, but the written word, and the stress that the Master has put on unity gives us the key to all things. After hearing this sad news, the Dreyfus-Barneys decided to shorten the trip and to join the Holy Family because Abdu'l-Bahá's family missed having them near. It was after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá that Shoghi Effendi invited several capable and experienced Baha'is, including Laura and Hippolyte, to Haifa to consult on the future of the Baha'i faith in February of 1922. It must have been consoling to Laura and Hippolyte to be with Shoghi Effendi and to be among these Western Baha'is, the majority of whom were close friends who had gathered in Haifa. Upon arrival, Laura wrote, "In the folds of this gentle mountain lies the body of my best friend and counselor, the Master." She also wrote to her sister that the Master's family was filling the great vacancy left in their lives by continual activity in carrying out his wishes. Several years after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, Laura wrote an article in which she expressed her deep feelings about her remembrance of Abdu'l-Bahá. She wrote, "I would like some time to step out of the world of my present life to describe how Abdu'l-Bahá appeared to me as I observed his majestic, sensitive beauty, his life, active and human, forceful and inspired. Without doubt, he knew beyond the present. The wise man sees the tree in the seed." Abdu'l-Bahá spoke also of another time when the mind and the heart, united, should establish true civilization. In her later years, Laura was always nostalgic about her visits and pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She reminisced about her early visits to Akka. "What wonderful days were those when I was in Akka and Haifa with the Master and the family." She was fully aware of the significance of her stays in the Holy Land. Unfortunately, because of poor health, she wasn't able to return despite her wishes. Her earthly life came to an end at the age of 94 in August of 1974. She was buried in the Passy Cemetery in Paris. She had requested that she be buried in the same plot as her sister Natalie. Her wishes to have a simple Baha'i service were respected. The death of Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney was widely reported in French and English newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. An appreciative cable message was sent by the Universal House of Justice to the National Assembly of France, recognizing her outstanding achievements during the heroic age of the faith. Hugo Giaccheri, who had known Laura for many years, wrote the following tribute. Her enthusiasm for this ideal, improving human relations, bringing together peoples of different races, classes, and nations, never lessened. Those who had the rare privilege of knowing her over a period of many decades can testify that her undaunted zeal for the objective of the brotherhood of man remained alive and glowing to the very last day of her life on earth. Let us now talk about Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney's numerous achievements. She had heard Abdu'l-Bahá state that we are not to keep for ourselves alone what he had entrusted to us for humanity. It was in following this advice that she devoted her life to implementing into action the principles that she had believed in with an outward-looking approach. The emphasis of the Baha'i faith and its teachings on the eradication of prejudice, the unity of the races, the rights of women, the brotherhood of all mankind, the universal peace must have appealed strongly to her. She devoted her life to the promotion of these ideals and these social causes. She became active with many progressive movements, with platforms that incorporated the Baha'i teachings. After World War I, Laura became interested in the League of Nations. The League was the first international intergovernmental organization whose principal mission was the maintenance of world peace and its social and humanitarian principles aligned with her own. Next slide, please. Another organization that attracted Laura to its goals was the International Council of Women. And since its inception, the Council's aims have been consistent: the unification of women's organizations for action to promote human rights, sexual equality, peace, and women's involvement in the international sphere. Next slide, please. All these were dear to Laura's heart. She became the council representative to the League of Nations and played important roles in different capacities. Laura worked tirelessly to increase the influence of women in international affairs and to assist persons in diplomatic and government circles to understand how feminine values could advance the cause of peace. She once had said that her activities with the International Council of Women were motivated by its goals, as earlier advanced by the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Laura organized a conference under the auspices of the League of Nations in Rome in 1934 that Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Italy at the time, attended. He and some other dignitaries spoke at the inaugural meeting of the Congress. Laura, who was a brilliant speaker, emphasized the importance of international peace in her talks during extensive travels around the world, which included traveling across Canada in 1932 and travels to several Middle Eastern countries in 1935. She was awarded the Chevalier of Honors in 1923-25 and was promoted to the ranks of the officer in the French Legion of Honor in 1937. As an American citizen, she had to leave Paris at the onset of World War I. After her return to Paris at the end of the war in 1946, Laura continued her work under the auspices of the United Nations. She was happy to see the teachings of her faith materializing through the work of the UN and UNESCO, helping to bring world consciousness to the importance of education and brotherhood throughout all the continents. This was the story of Laura Barney and her meetings with Abdu'l-Bahá, and details of some of her accomplishments. Perhaps it was after meeting Abdu'l-Bahá that she found the path of service, which she followed for the rest of her life. She had accepted the teachings of the Baha'i faith and became devoted to the person of Abdu'l-Bahá. It was his attributes that had attracted her. Laura opened her heart and mind to him and became his disciple. As we know, her most important achievement was some answered questions. It was her greatest service to her faith, a memento for future generations, a significant book from the utterances of Abdu'l-Bahá. This book is an authoritative repository of Abdu'l-Bahā's profound insight. Not only was this book of momentous importance at the time of its publication, but it has continued to be so over a century after its publication. Some Answered Questions is the only work to be considered part of the sacred writings of the Baha'i faith that was not written by one of its central figures. The hope and happiness that Laura Barney found after meeting Abdu'l-Bahá and hearing his words stayed with her for the rest of her life. She became both practical and spiritual. She always remembered that Abdu'l-Bahá had told her to seek worthy outlets in all her actions. Laura truly believed that it was only through action that she could be nearer to the beloved. She always remembered that he had also advised her and those near him not to keep for ourselves alone what he has entrusted to us for humanity. Abdu'l-Bahá had noticed Laura's capacity and given her many responsibilities. He nurtured this brilliant woman, trained her at a young age, and had prayed God for confirmations and assistance for her. He had stated to her that she was the only one who attained to such a bounty. Abdu'l-Bahá replied to a question of how to be a Baha'i. He responded, "To be a Baha'i simply means to love all the world, to love humanity, and try to serve it, to work for universal peace and universal brotherhood." Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney followed Abdu'l-Bahā's advice. As promised by Abdu'l-Bahá, she received heavenly blessings.
Thank you so much for this inspiring, motivating presentation on the life of someone I'm sure so many people who have read some answered questions have wondered about, and who I'm sure we had no idea had accomplished just this much in her life from such a young age. I wanted to give you a moment to also comment if there are any additional things you wish to share with us, dear Mona Jun, before I open the floor for questions.
Actually, I'm looking forward to hearing your audience's reflections, impressions, any further discussions, any questions. I'm ready to answer.
Thank you so much. Friends, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand in the participant window, or you can type your question in the chat box. To raise your hand, you can click reactions and just click on raise hand. If you're typing in a question in the chat, you can open it with a question mark, so it's easier to tell. You can also message me privately, and I'll try to share your question without acknowledging your identity. Before we start, I'd like you to look in the chat to see there should be a link to the George Ronald Publishers website. If you'd like to be placed in the email list for updates, please put your email address in the chat. The book that is coming out, Some Questions Answered, I believe I want to get the title right. The Life of Laura Barney is going to be published in January. So please do use the chat for that to be sure that you receive updates.
I didn't know, Jun, you asked me if I had anything to say. Before the program started, you asked me how to address this lady, whether you should say Laura Barney, Laura Clifford Barney, or Laura Dreyfus-Barney. So for the sake of the audience, I should say that she was Laura Clifford Barney. So the Baha'is know her as Laura Clifford Barney because Some Answered Question was published, was compiled before she got married. So to the Baha'i world, she's known as Laura Clifford Barney. Then she got married in 1911, and her husband and herself adopted the two last names, Dreyfus-Barney. So after her marriage, she was known as Mrs. Dreyfus-Barney. And then to some others, she was known as Madame Barney or Laura Barney, because they are two sisters, Natalie Barney and Laura Barney. So she's also known as Laura Barney. So whichever name you call her, it will be fine. And in the title of my book, I decided to go for the shorter version, which is Laura Barney. So to clarify, to answer your earlier question.
Thank you for remembering. Okay, I have a note in the chat for, let's see, Faridun, I see that you have your hand up.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. It certainly clears some issues for me. And interesting enough, my wife and I visited Tanon, France. On the building you show, it's no longer a hotel. it is turned to condominiums, and some of them bought by Baha'is, and one of the Baha'is there was our host. So it was interesting to see that, and some of the furniture on the entrance was the same that when Abdu'l-Bahá was staying there. My question or clarification, maybe you explain it, is that the book of Mufawizat that we know in Farsi actually is a answer that Abdu'l-Bahá said was in Farsi, but was it then translated to English and then translated to Farsi? So the book of Mufawizat, is that the translation of the English version, or is it the word of Abdu'l-Bahá before translation? Thank you.
Thank you for your comment and your question. Yes, I have visited the hotel where Abdu'l-Bahá stayed, which is not a hotel anymore, and it has turned into condominiums. It's a very historical place to visit because that was the first place in the Western world where Abdu'l-Bahá stayed. As to your question about Mufawizat, I believe Mufawizat, the answers from Abdu'l-Bahá were in Persian. As I said in my presentation today, I'm not going to discuss some answered question in detail, but at the table where the questions were answered, Dr. Yunus Khan was sitting on the right-hand side of Abdu'l-Bahá, Laura Barney was sitting to his left, and then another British Baha'i was sitting to Laura's left-hand side, and they were secretaries, Persian speakers who were sitting at the table. So, and by that time, when Laura posed her questions, she had learned Farsi, she had learned Persian. And in my book, I explained exactly how she had learned it and where she had learned it. So she posed her questions. The answers of Abdu'l-Bahá were written in Persian. He read and approved the Persian, and that's how Mufawizat came into being. Her English version is what she had worked on based on her knowledge of Persian and her translations. And the French came with her husband's help, which was translated into French. So the short answer to your question is that Mufawizat is from Persian utterances of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Please raise your hand in the chat window or on the screen. Yes, I see.
This is Mina.
Please,
Mina
ahead, Mina.
Bailey, yes. It's a comment that I've been listening to this presentation for third time, and it's very interesting. Every time I learn more and more about it. But I just have a question that Laura, did she have any children or she didn't have any?
She didn't have any children. And to your comment that you have heard me speak, you have been at many of my presentations. And to be honest, I don't get tired listening to her story either. Honestly.
Because it's wonderful.
I get inspired every time I hear it myself.
That's
Not
wonderful.
looking at
Thank you.
myself, but just hearing what she had done, what Abdu'l-Bahá said about her. And I find it interesting myself too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go right ahead, Ismail.
Thank you, Mona. This was very wonderful. What inspired you to begin researching about Laura Barney and to write her biography?
Thank you, Ismail, for a wonderful question. When I started, I didn't know I would spend 21 years researching and writing about this lady. I thought it's a simple project and I will get over with it. But I have never regretted any minute or day that I have spent researching. So, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I do mention it in the book, how I started researching. Her family's home is in Washington, D.C. In the year 2000, the house was being sold, and the contents of the house were being auctioned off. And Abdu'l-Bahá has visited that house 3 or 4 times. So, and her family's home is not very far from where I live. So I decided to go to the house, visit the house, and then afterwards I went to the archives of Smithsonian. That's where her documents are held. I wanted to see if I can find any important material that may be in the archives and I'm not aware, or they are not at the archives at the World Center. So that's how I started researching about her. And I knew a little about her, like majority of people. I knew she had compiled some answered questions. I have read maybe a little about her in the Baha'i world and some other places, but the more I researched, the less I found. And so I started my research, and it never stopped, even though my book is going to be published soon. I'm still researching. Maybe the 2nd edition, I can add more to it, because daily, not daily anymore, but I'm finding new material about her life. It's never ending. So that's how I started about 21 years ago in the year 2000.
Paria, please go ahead. We have about 5 minutes or so from our questions.
I actually had a question about, Monojin was speaking about all of the travels and the incredible work that about Laura Barney's life. And it seemed like her approach to life was so outward reaching. And I thought if maybe you could share a little bit about this for an incredible Western woman of her time, to have such an outward reaching approach in her life and the work that she did. Could you share a little bit more about that, and maybe how it would empower women of today when we think about, the evolution of equality, of gender equality that you spoke about and her work in it? Thank you.
Thank you, Paria John. I hope everybody thinks about her life and see how we can empower ourselves to be as outward looking as she was at her time. She came from a very well-to-do family. She was of high society. The life that she followed was not in line with the way her family lived. She was very unusual. So I attribute that to the teachings of the Baha'i faith that she accepted at a very young age, and she followed until the end of her life, and she was inspired by those, and she wasn't just a believer, she put those beliefs into action. She was for the equality of men and women. She was for world unity, for world peace, that humanity is one. She devoted her whole life. She had a long life. She lived until she was 94 years old. Almost to the end of her life, she was active. She traveled around the world at the request of Abdu'l-Bahá while he was alive. And later on, she traveled to Middle Eastern countries. She traveled around across Canada. She traveled between New York, Washington, Paris, and Geneva to attend the League of Nations and United Nations to promote these causes that she was inspired with. And she had an outward-looking approach from the beginning. The acceptance of the Baha'i teachings are different for each of us. Some go travel teaching, some pioneer. For her, it was through her actions. And as I mentioned in my presentation, it was what stayed with her, what Abdu'l-Bahá had told her to do, to have an outward-looking approach.
I'd like to jump in with a question. Dear Mona, if we look at her life and all she accomplished, I mean, it couldn't have been easy at that time. Did she have any opposition from her family? How did they react to her going to visit Haifa or Akka and meet this personage? Or how did they react to, and what about the other restrictions that would have been in place on women at the time? Like, the way that we hear is just accomplishment after accomplishment. If you could speak a little bit to those obstacles and how she overcame them?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, she did have opposition, not only from her family, but also from the society. In my book, I make references to the newspaper articles making fun of her of the fact that she had gone to Haifa and Akka, for the fact that she had followed this Eastern spiritual leader. She invited Abdu'l-Faza'el, a Baha'i scholar, and accompanied him to Paris and then to Washington, D.C. He stayed in Washington for about 2 years. Imagining Abdu'l-Faza'el with a turban and abba walking in the streets of Washington, D.C. And this was a family who, especially her father, cared a lot about their name and their status. He wanted to belong to the high society of Washington. That's why they had moved to the capital city, and he was not happy at all with the way she was going. And for this reason, and for another reason, he passed away very early. I mean, these were not the only reasons. He didn't have a very clean lifestyle. He had a heart attack and he passed away in 1902. So she did have opposition. I don't know from outside world, because she became active with League of Nations and she became active with International Council of Women. So they were all like-minded organizations who supported her work and helped her. So she didn't have oppositions from those organizations, but from her family and society, yes. And her family, because of their prominence, her mother was a well-known artist, philanthropist, and civic society leader. Her sister was a famous salon holder in Paris. She had a different lifestyle and very well known. So she was in the news all the time, her family and herself. I have maybe about 100 articles or more of her family in the newspaper. They had not only in Washington, D.C., but across the United States, and even sometimes in Europe. Their family affairs were reported in the media. So she did have some objections, yes, but she never wavered. She never changed her beliefs, and she stayed active until the end of her life.
Wow, thank you so much, dear Mona. And thank you especially for taking the time to join us today, give us your time while you're recovering from a cold and being sick. We wanted to extend our love to you, and we want to dedicate, dear friends, the closing prayers in remembrance of the beloved Master Abdu'l-Bahá.
Life lived for others will never fade. All through the world still His presence remains. Teachings of peace, an exemplar of love. 100 years now have passed since He's gone. Just like the sunlight, His words lit the hearts, traveling the lands to ignite in us a spark, a spark of love. Care, peace, and service, justice and grace, friendship, respect for the human race. This virtuous station, this mighty great law, live in the title of Abdu'l-Bahá. Live in the title of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Oh my God, oh my God, unite the hearts of thy servants. Oh my God, oh my God, reveal to them thy great purpose. May they follow thy commandments and abide in thy law, and abide in thy law. Help them, oh God, in their endeavor, and grant them strength to serve by the light of thy knowledge. Cheer their hearts by thy love. Verily, thou art their helper and their Lord, and their Lord, and their Lord. Oh my God, oh my God.
Thank you so much, dear Mona June and dear friends, for gathering here today and for sharing with us this special presentation on Laura Barney. I wanted to extend on behalf of the Nova Baha'i Center Sunday morning program its gratitude for the use of the video courtesy of the Wilmette Institute of Ms. Mona Khademi on this presentation. And also those of you who'd like to stay on, we can continue after the recording ends for further Q&A for a few minutes.